Thanks, Pan. I hope you can all hear me. Good morning, everyone. So, as Pan said, I'm Angus Miller. I'm a Solution Architect at the Australian Digital Health Agency, but I also have a keen passion in FHIR and play around with it a fair bit. So, I suppose we'll jump straight in. So, the things we're going to cover today, they're quite the sort of basic things with FHIR, and a lot of them are really just HTTP concepts and RESTful concepts with sort of FHIR overlaid over the top of them. So we're going to look at what is FHIR, what will you need to play with FHIR, because we are trying to set you up for if you're coming to the Connectathon so that you sort of can hit the ground running and have the tools and the basic knowledge of how to play with FHIR a bit. What should you know when playing with FHIR? Just some tips and the gotchas at the beginning, and we'll just touch on FHIR clinical terminology and FHIR operations because they're also quite key to FHIR terminology. So a bit of background. So what is FHIR? So FHIR. So Graham Greaves, who's an Australian out of Melbourne, he sort of instigated FHIR at the beginning back in August 2011. Is when he wrote a straw man version that was presented to a HL7 working group. It's come a long way since 2011. It was first called Resources for Health, so it was originally called RFH, which wasn't quite as sexy as FHIR, so I think they improved the name. FHIR today is still standard for trial use in an official sense. It's currently at STU 3.01, and I will highlight that's the version that will primarily be used at the Connectathon. FHIR Release 4, which is coming sometime this year, I think, will be the first release that begins to contain normative elements. FHIR's versioning is somewhat different to previous standards where it's broken up into different parts, so parts will become normative, not the entire standard, and that's the way it will move forward. I will say it's already in use, even though it's standard for trial use. There is a lot of use already happening out there in the real world, and that's partly part of its success. FHIR is more than just a transport format, so if you're familiar with other HL7 standards like HL7 version 2, which is what is primarily used in Australia and in healthcare systems, or CDA, those predecessors really didn't define how you sent the data. It just defined a format you put the data in and sort of left how you send it to around the place up to you, although people did corral around certain ways to do it, especially in version 2. But it wasn't really specified by HL7 how to send it, and neither in CDA. FHIR is different. It does tell you how to send it and actually defines a full API, a RESTful API of how to send resources around and how to work with them. And as I said, it's a RESTful API, which is used by many successful companies in the world today. All the big internet companies, Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, many others, they all use a RESTful architecture, and FHIR is no different. Extensibility is built into FHIR from day one, so FHIR is quite open and honest about it focuses on the 80% and allows extensibility to cover the rest. So it covers the core use cases, but built into FHIR is a very strong model about how to extend it. It's not as sort of loose as V2 where you just create a Z segment. It actually defines exactly how you can add extra content to your FHIR resources. So just a summary of those HL7 standards. I commonly find that people say we use HL7 and it's sort of, well, what do you mean by that? Primarily they mean version 2 because that's what is sort of used in most health institutions. But of course there's version 3 messaging, which has had very little use in the UK, and also CDA, which is used by the Australian Digital Health Agency and the My Health Record. And that word RIM there, I think it's Reference Information Model, is the same, is the model those two standards are backed onto. It's sort of like a healthcare model. FHIR comes along after that, and it is a completely sort of restart, and that's what we're looking at today. So just across those different standards, they actually have quite a different sort of paradigm as to what they do or what they're achieving. So HL7 version 2 messaging is an event-based, it's a messaging paradigm, and really that's what that means is an event happens somewhere, and then here's the data for that event. So if you're used to hospital ADT messaging, A patient's admitted and a message is sent. A pathology report is created and a message is sent. So it's a message paradigm. CDA is a document paradigm. It basically says a document was published. Here is a document, like a piece of A4 page. A CDA document is representing that. FHIR is quite different to those further two. We'll say FHIR has a messaging and a document paradigm built into it, somewhat to be backwards compatible, but it's probably not the primary way that FHIR be used. It's really there to support the old models. So FHIR is really a resource-orientated paradigm. And so what that means is we have a set of resources that represent granular clinical concepts like patient or practitioner, or diagnostic report or observation. And those independent resources are linked together with keys to form a higher level concept, so like a pathology report. So a pathology report in FHIR is a web of many resources. It probably has a patient resource, a diagnostic report resource, observation resources, practitioner resources, all coming together to form the pathology report. So what will you need to play with FHIR, especially for the Connectathon? So the first thing you probably need is the specification. It's available on the internet. You can search for it, search for FHIR, and make sure you get the right release, because every release is on the internet. So we want to look with STU3 and specifically version 3.01. But you'll find STU1 and STU2 out there as well. So just make sure you're looking at the right one. It's at the top there. And that yellow banner at the top will take you to the list of all the other versions. But make sure you're looking at version 3.01. You're going to need a set of tools. So primarily, you're going to need a laptop, and I highlight that because we've had people come to Connectathons without laptops, so we do say you do need to bring a laptop with you if you're going to play with FHIR. You're going to need a HTTP post client. So the two common brands out there is Fiddler or Postman. They're both free and you can download them off the internet. I'd highly recommend Postman. It's nice and simple to use. And we don't particularly need, very advanced features of the HTTP post client. We just need the basic bare minimum, and Postman absolutely gives you that. A text editor of your choice, so Notepad, preferably one with some syntax highlighting, Notepad++, Sublime, Microsoft Code, Visual Studio Code, anyone, it doesn't really matter. And you're going to need a FHIR server, but you don't need to bring one with you. There are many available on the internet, publicly available on the internet, and there's probably be some actually in the room on the day at the Connectathon, and at the Connectathon you'll be able to access all the publicly available ones. There's a link there at the bottom. If you go there, you'll see a big long list of publicly available FHIR servers that are scattered all over the world. So above that red line, they're really things you must have. If you don't have those, you can probably get away without the text editor, but it's good to have. But you really need those to actually do anything with FHIR. Below the line there is getting more advanced. So if you're a developer, you probably want to bring your development environment. You can use C# or Java. There's actually other libraries you could use, and the FHIR development libraries. So FHIR has some very strong libraries out there to work with FHIR, so I'd highly advise you not to start building your own client to work with FHIR. You can, but you're just making life hard for yourself. And part of that standardization process is if we form around the same libraries, then we get better standardization. So there's .NET libraries, there's Java libraries called Happy. There's also others in JavaScript and a number of other languages. So just looking at that specification again, and really I'm just going to point out that if you're starting out new, what should you read? Because there's a lot in that specification and you can get a little bit lost as to where do I start. From my experience, if you actually want to play with FHIR, send some messages around, these are the three core things to start with, and I do them in this order. So RESTful API, really useful to read. It'll give you the foundation of how to interact with a FHIR server, and what we're really only going to scratch the surface of today. The next one is the search and the search parameter registry. More that one on the left, search. So pretty quickly you're going to realize that I need to find resources in FHIR servers, and that's what search is all about. And operations is slightly more advanced, but if we're working with clinical terminology, there's 3 operations which are quite key to doing it, and I'll explain operations a bit later. I would then go to the resource page, and there are about 100 resources. They're all the different clinical concepts. I would start with patient as a familiar place, just because it won't confuse you with the clinical stuff. It's just a patient, and it's fairly familiar to people. And you should familiarize yourself with these resource pages. Not every one of them, because every one of them is actually structured exactly the same. But so just get familiar with looking at any one of them, and focus on the structure definition. So you'll see a nice little graph there, an image of a tree structure, which is how your resource is structured. And right below it at the bottom, you'll see all the search parameters defined for that resource. How can I search for this resource? And they're probably the 2 key elements on every page. This is what the resource looks like, and this is the search parameters for it. And there's other information there, description of what it's for. So spend a bit of time looking across them a bit, just getting familiar with how they all look. But don't feel like you have to learn all of them. Just maybe concentrate on patient so you get familiar with how one resource looks. And then you use the others as a need to know. When you have to create an observation resource, go look at that one. Operations. So once again, the FHIR spec, there's a tab at the top, operations. There's a big list of operations that do different things. For the clinical terminology connectathon, you should really concentrate on these 3 operations I've got here. Sorry, I've only highlighted one on the screen because the other one's further up the list. But value set expansion, concept map translation, and value set base validation are the 3 that are used in terminology operations, and I'll talk a bit more of those near the end.
Excuse me, can you get the guys to mute their mics?
Yeah, we can hear a lot of chair moving in the background, someone. So the other thing to be just somewhat familiar with is either XML or JSON. So pretty much all FHIR servers are agnostic. They use either one of these standards interchangeably. Like you can send an XML resource to a server and have it return to you in JSON, or you can say, no, I'll send it in JSON and I'll get it back in JSON, or all XML. So being familiar with any one of these, you don't need to know both. It's nice to know both, but you might just be comfortable with XML. That's fine, just use XML. Or you're comfortable with JSON, just use JSON. Or you want to flick between them, that's fine. And you don't need to know advanced stuff here. Like you don't need to really deeply know XML name spacing, which can get a little bit complex. You really just need to be familiar with how it's formatted, understand the angle brackets on the end of the elements and the attributes, and that's about it. These are those post clients, the HTTP clients. So on the left-hand side is Fiddler, on the right-hand side is Postman. This is a tool you're really going to have. If you're just using it basic level, this is just sort of your base level you need is this tool, because this is the tool you use to talk to FHIR servers. And if you're using a development environment like Visual Studio or Eclipse, that's fine too, and you probably don't need a Postman, but even there, it's probably still a useful tool. So people coming really new, green, trying to work out how does this work, you absolutely need one of these, and I would highly recommend the one on the right because of its simplicity, and many people use it. So I'm going to jump in a bit and just talk about searching. Search is just a get, and we'll explain how to do a get, so it's a get operation. And you can see here I've got a number of URLs. So at the start there, we've got a FHIR server somewhere. So HTTPS, some server somewhere, /FHIR. So that server is going to change depending on which server you're pointing at. But it stays the same when you work with that server. And then you see after FHIR, and most endpoints end with FHIR, meaning the FHIR endpoint is here, some server /FHIR. And then after that, you've got the resource name, so patient we're seeing here. So I'm interested in patient resources. Then the question mark indicates now here is the query. And then we've got family here, and that comes from the FHIR standard. If you go look at the patient resource, go to the very bottom, it lists all the search parameters, and one of them is family. And the next slide will show you that. And then equals, and then the name of the person I'm looking for, Miller. So this will give, that top one there will just give you all resources in that FHIR server where the family name contains Miller. The next one's much the same, but now I'm saying family name Miller and given name Angus, and it's going to return all resources with a family name Miller and a given name Angus. The next one is got an or statement in it, so I'm saying family name Miller and given name Angus, comma, or meaning or Gus. So it's going to give me or with where they have a given name of Angus or Gus. The next one is doing an identifier search. So I want all patient resources that have a particular identifier on them, and the one I'm looking for is Medicare number. And that has a system name, as you can see there, nselectronichealth.net.au ID Medicare number. And you could find that on the Australian base profile pages for FHIR. And that should be now static, that's always the system you use to find a Medicare number. Of course, if we're using some other number, like a DVA number or an IHI number, that system would change to the appropriate system for that identifier. And then on the end is just the number. I'm going to break that one down on the next slide too. So as I said, all the search parameters for each resource are defined in the FHIR specification at the bottom of each resource page. They're unique for that resource. Some servers may not support all the search parameters, so there's no mandatory thing that says a FHIR server must support all search parameters. They just support whatever they choose to support. So the FHIR standard certainly says, hey, these are the ones that we primarily think you should do, and this is how you do them. And most servers should do that. But some might just do a subset of that, and some might even define completely brand new ones that aren't in the FHIR spec, and that's fine too. So how do I know? So every FHIR server, the one mandatory thing in FHIR servers is that you can't call it a FHIR server unless it can return this thing called a metadata resource, which is just another resource, and it should always be at your server / metadata. And it's a resource which will tell you what this server can do. And it will list that for patient resources, I support these search parameters, and it'll list them all for every resource. So you might find you hit a server and you ask for, I'd hope not, but ask for family name and it says unsupported search parameter. And if you go look at their metadata resource, you'll find that it's not in there. That's probably a strange scenario, but the more esoteric search parameters, maybe that's the case. So that's how you know, does this server support these things? There are other complex searches, which I won't go into today, such as chaining and includes. There's one there at the bottom, so I'm saying diagnostic reports where the subject of the diagnostic report is a patient with the family name Miller. So I'm really getting one resource type by saying, is this resource linked to this other resource, and does that other resource have this search parameter? We won't go into that today, and you'll find at an entry level you don't really need to get into that depth. It's probably your next step up. Just understanding those first four is going to do you fine to start with. So a bit more on search parameters. So here, this is just a screenshot taken from the bottom of the patient resource in the FHIR spec. And you can see it's called search parameters, and it's just a list. So you can see the name of the search parameter, family. It has a type, it's of type string, and a description of what it searches on. So this is where you see them, and that's how they look like in the spec. Be aware that each search parameter has a type. So there are only 8 types listed on the right there. So number, date, time, string, token, reference, composite, quantity, and URL. So it's not as simple as just saying, what is my search parameter, but what type is it? And that's because I can't search for a date time and say equals Miller, because that's not a date time. So how do I actually give FHIR a date time? And if you go to the FHIR spec, it will explain every one of those formats and how you lay them out. Most of them are really simple, like family name's just a string, so it's just any string. Number, it's just any number, a whole integer or a decimal. Date time is just a date time in a particular format. Token is a little bit more complex, and we'll have a look at that one in a sec. Reference is how we reference between FHIR resources. So give me diagnostic reports that have a reference to this patient. Composite is a bit like 2 search parameters together, and it's probably the hardest one, so I wouldn't spend too much time trying to understand it yet. You'll come to it. Quantity is once again a number. That's a decimal number. I think number is just an integer, where quantity is a decimal. And URI is like a web address. You know, it doesn't have a URI of www.google.com. So every search parameter has a type. So this is just looking at that one of those types, which is the token type. So this is the one we use for finding Medicare numbers, the identifier on patient. So the search parameter has a name. This one for patient is called identifier. It has a type, and for the identifier search parameter on patients, it's of type token. And that token has a format, and you can see the syntax down the bottom. So in green, the parameter would be identifier. The system would be the system for the identifier I'm trying to find. So in our case, that's this nselectronichealth.net.au ID Medicare number, and that will be different depending on what type of identifier you're looking for. And then the code at the end, or in this case, the identifier, the actual value. So there's our example down the bottom. So, and down the bottom there's the link to the search page in FHIR. It was one of those 3 that I told you at the beginning to read about, and that will tell you in detail about all of the 8 different search parameter types. So now I'm going to talk about the actual sending of resources back and forth between the server, and which is really just HTTP, what the internet's driven on. So there's only a small number of concepts we need to grasp for HTTP. There's not too much in it. These concepts, they're not FHIR concepts. They're RESTful and HTTP concepts that FHIR's built on top of. So there's really only 4 key things you need to get your head around with HTTP. And that is that we have a URL, which is where I'm sending this request to. It's the server. We have a method. Am I trying to post something, get something, put something, or delete something? And you can see they sort of translate to post is create, get is read or search, put is to update or create, and delete is to delete, obviously. So we need to just choose between one of those 4 methods for every call. And then we have HTTP headers. So headers are just a list of parameter value pairs. So and in FHIR, there's 2 that you really need to get your head around to begin with. There are some others which are more advanced things, but there are these 2 that are key to trip you up at the start if you're not familiar with them. And I'll talk about them on the next slide. And then the body. And the body is just the payload. It's just the FHIR resource that you're sending. Or it may be no body. If you're doing a search, you don't have to send a FHIR resource, so there is no body. But they're the 4 concepts you need to get your head around. So here are those 4 concepts in your Postman client. So Postman client literally looks like this screen, and there really isn't any other screens. This is doing the request. So at the top, we've got the method, which is a drop down there, and you can choose put, post, create, delete, or put, post, delete, or the other one, get. The URL that we're sending this request to, the headers, which we're going to go into right now. There's 2 headers we have to use, which are those 2. And the body, which is literally the FHIR resource that we want to send. And that's it, those 4 concepts. And then we hit the big blue send button, and away it goes. So let's talk about those headers, and we really need to broach this topic of content negotiation. And this is about telling the server and the server telling you what sort of format are we using. Are we using XML or JSON? There's actually even another format, but I wouldn't use it at the moment, called Turtle. Primarily, we can use XML and JSON. So because we can use these 2, we need to communicate to the server which one am I using and which one do I want you to use when you return to me. And that's what these 2 HTTP headers are doing for you. You've got the accept header and the content type header. And they really only have 2 properties, application/FHIR plus JSON, meaning I want to talk in JSON, or application/FHIR XML, meaning I want to talk in XML. So when we talk to the FHIR server, sending our HTTP packet, which is the big box in the middle, we've got our URL at the top, we're doing a get, and then we've got our headers. We have to send these headers to the server to talk about, well, I want to talk about XML. So content type. So content type is what you're telling the server what I'm giving it. So the content type I'm giving the FHIR server is in a JSON format. So if I'm sending JSON to the server, I need to tell the server using the content type header that this is application FHIR /FHIR plus JSON. That's what I'm giving you. If you said this is JSON but you gave it XML, it would error. It'd go, you said you were giving me JSON, but I don't know what this stuff is. In return, when you request, you can say, what do I want back? So I accept content returned to me from the FHIR server in XML format. So that's the accept header, that's the other one. So when I ask the server to get me a resource, I can say, when you return it to me, I want it in XML, or I want it in JSON, and that's what the accept header is doing. So here's that when you hit the send button, we're sending over the two headers. I accept JSON, but I want my content in XML, and the FHIR server is replying to me, here is your content, and it's in JSON. The content type is JSON. Here are those two headers in your Postman client. So you have to set them in your Postman client. Postman won't just natively know about FHIR. You have to literally type in accept and those two properties. You can save them in Postman, so you don't have to keep typing them every time. But they are key to have in there. If you don't do them at all, the FHIR server is going to default to whatever it defaults to, most likely JSON, and that may be not what you're expecting. So by setting these once and then saving them, then you never have to worry again, and you've got the power to control what content type you're sending. And there they are. So that really trips new players up to start with, just understanding that concept. So sort of wrap your head around that, and that's probably the only barrier at the beginning to understanding what's going on. So I'll just do this site here called FHIR Drills is actually a site that I and some other guys at the agency sort of put together, and it's covering these basic concepts in a sort of interactive tutorial. So it's actually hooked up to a FHIR server, and it's a web page, and it tells you in detail how to do create, read, update, delete, and explains them to you in length. So highly advised that if you're really new to FHIR, that maybe going to that website and spending 10-15 minutes just going through the simple patient tutorial will really get you up to speed with just how do I talk to a FHIR server. It covers in more depth than I can today how that works, and it's quite easy. So now it's going to turn to FHIR clinical terminology. So FHIR specification has put a lot of effort into improving and the maintainability and the delivery of clinical terminology, and really in that SNOMED space, keeping it up to date. But we're talking all clinical terminology here, and in fact, when it comes to FHIR, we're talking about all terminology. It doesn't necessarily have to be clinical. It could be just a list of codes that represent my hospitals. It's not really clinical, but it's all managed in the same way. Some particular FHIR servers out there are dedicated to this function, and the CSIRO Onto server that is at the Connectathon is one of those servers. So it's not really made to consume a patient resource, but it's really good at terminology. So when you use that server, that's its use case. There are 3 core FHIR resources that manage terminology. So of the 100-odd resources, these 3 are the ones that are core to terminology. Code system, which is a catalog of codes. Value set, which is a collection of codes for use, and they come from one of the code systems. So the value set is the one that you actually use, where the code system's like the repository of codes that you could use, and then you select codes from that into a value set for use. And the last one is concept map, which is for mapping from one code in one value set to another code in another value set. So it's that mapping concept. And really, they're the 3 core resources you need to get your head around for using terminology with FHIR. Here's just a little demonstration. So an example. So if I worked in an organization, it's a global organization, it had many hospitals across the world. So they may create a code system FHIR resource that lists every single hospital and the code for those hospitals. A big catalog of all the hospitals for Acme Healthcare across the world. Now, that's just the master catalog in the code system. It's not particularly the one that anyone wants to use. When I hit a drop-down box in Australia, I don't really want to have to pick the hospital in Washington, USA. So we don't really use the code system in operation. We use a subset of the code system. And that's where value set comes in. It adds value to the user. So from the code system, I select all the codes for my Australian hospitals, for instance, that I want to display in my patient administration system, so in the PAS. And I create a value set for that purpose. So I create a value set that means something to my users on that drop-down or on this field that they have to enter a code in. And it's referencing the code system where these codes came from. And then I might create another value set for another use case. So in Western Australia, I only want to see the WA hospitals. So I just create another value set, but I just put the ones in there that I need for this use case. So it's value sets that we use in operation, and the code system is more the master catalog of where these codes came from. And this is true for something like SNOMED. SNOMED itself, all the SNOMED codes, is a code system. Every single SNOMED code in one code system. But when I hit a drop-down, I don't want to have to select from millions of SNOMED codes. So we have a set of value sets which are selecting particular SNOMED codes from particular regions and making that list smaller for my use case. I'll also highlight that a value set doesn't have to pick codes from the same code system. I can select codes from one code system, codes from another, and put them into my value set. My value set might have codes from numerous other code systems. It's just a collection for use. And then we've got concept map right there in the center. And concept map is leveraging those value sets, and it's just a simple mapping, and it only goes in one direction. So on the left here, I've got my Acme hospital code system. I've selected a small value set for my use case, which is the FHIR value set for Acme. And then I create a new resource called a concept map, and I'm referencing the value set on the left, which has A, B, C, D in it, and I'm mapping to a different value set on the right, which is HPIO identifiers in Australia for healthcare organisations. So I'm saying the Acme code ABC is equal to this HPIO in Australia, and the concept map is doing that mapping for me. The concept map maps from value set to value set, and it's one direction only. So then we use those in terminology with FHIR operations. So the FHIR servers will claim to support particular operations, and 3 of those operations might be these terminology operations. And of course, the Onto server does this really well. So an operation in FHIR is much like calling a method or a function. So it's not about getting a resource. It's about there is a method on the FHIR server that does something for me, and it's always signified with $. And that method can be hung off the FHIR server in 3 different locations. So it can be a method that acts on the entire FHIR server, so it's just at the base operation. So my FHIR server, $, the operation. And the operation might be like add 2 numbers together and takes 2 parameters, and it just doesn't add. Probably not a very useful operation, but that's all operations are. And the operations are defined in the FHIR server. So we can have at the base, we can have operations on top of a resource type. So concept map will have, FHIR server concept map will have the operations that you can apply to concept maps. And then the last place is on an instance. So not just generically across concept maps, but this particular concept map, the one with the identifier 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So operations live at those 3 different levels, depending on the context of the operation. So these are those 3 core operations used in FHIR terminology. So concept translation. So this is translating from one code to another. So it's using that concept map. You can see in the URL the concept map. The next one is value set expansion. And this is where I'm basically saying, give me a set of codes, and I can apply a filter. So notice it's pointing to a value set, the instance 23, and it's saying expand filter abdo. So I'm saying go to this value set, the one that's got the identifier 23, and give me the codes that have abdo in them. And that might be the drop-down list I showed to someone. I might not even put a filter on it, which means just give me all the codes from that value set. And I can do other filters where I can say, has abdo all this or and that. And the last one is value set base validation. And this is really where you receive a code from someone and you want to check, is that in one of my value sets? So once again, we're saying value set 23 is the value set I'm interested in. Dollar validate code, which is the operation. And then question mark, this is the code I'm validating. It has a system of low-inc org. It has a code of 1963-8 and the display text of test. And that operation is just going to go and look in that value set and see if that code's in it. If it is, it's going to say, yes, that's valid, or no, it's not in that value set. And that's really the three operations you need to get your head around for terminology with FHIR. They're the core ones. Understand those three and how to use them, and you've somewhat mastered terminology with FHIR and using Onto server. Oh, here's time. So I'll just explain this top concept translation. So it looks rather complex, and I've colorized it to try and explain it to you. So this is a translation. We're using the concept map, and we want to translate from one code to another. So we're saying concept map, because that's where this operation lives, and it's $translate is the name of the operation. And then we're saying, we're telling it about the code I have. It has a system of HTTP, HL7org, FHIR, composition status, and the code is preliminary. So that's the code I have. And then I'm saying, given the value set HTTP, HL7org, FHIR value set composition status, where I believe this code comes from, I want to map it to a equal code that lives in the target value set, HL7org, FHIR value set v3 act status. And the FHIR server is going to go and find the concept map that does that translation and return it to you. You can also do this where you specify the actual concept map I want to use, where if you don't specify it, it's just going to find the concept map that does this translation for you. The other two are self-explanatory. I will do a quick demonstration of the search. I had it here. So here's our Postman client. And at the top here, I've got a URL to a FHIR server that lives out on the internet. So that stays the same. You see I've got my two headers here, the accept header and the content type header. So when I do this GET request, I'm saying I want to send XML, although in this case it's a GET, so I'm not even sending anything, but it doesn't matter that I say I'm going to send XML even if I'm sending nothing. But what is key is content type. Sorry, I've gone around the wrong way. Content type is what I'm sending, accept is what I want back. So I'm saying I want XML back. What I'm sending is XML, although when I do a GET, I'm not actually sending anything. So here's our base server. Now I can do things like patient, which is just the patient resource. And I'm not even searching for any type of patient. And if I hit send, it's returning me the total results is 388. It's just returning me every patient resource in the server because I didn't apply a filter. I just said patient. So it's returned all the patients to me and it's paged. So the paging is here. It's returning me the first page of the entire set. And here's the last page. Here's the next page. And here's the page we're on. And then here is my patient resources beginning, the first one. And if I collapse that, there's another patient resource below it. And notice it's returned a bundle resource. And that's because when I do a search, I'm asking for many. So it can't return me a patient resource because I expect many resources. And the bundle is a type of resource that just contains resources for you. So this is a search bundle, and it's just returning you a list of patients, one in every entry here. Patient here, there's a patient here, there's a patient here, and on and on. So I can further this resource, this search, by doing a question mark and saying I want to search. So I might want ones that have a family name equal to Miller. And click send, do that search. And it comes back and it's found one. It's the same bundle again. It's got paging, but there's only one page. And here's my entry and here's my patient resource. And if I scroll down and look through the patient resource, I'll find that it has a family name of Miller. And of course I could have gone and given equals, now if I go XXXX, it didn't find any. There's no resources that have a given name XXXX. But if I say Angus, we find that same resource again. And that's pretty much how searching works. It's as simple as adding search parameters on here and getting what you want. And I'll show you that in the FHIR spec. So here's the FHIR spec. I go to resources. These are all the resources that we have. And the one we might be interested in is patient. It describes at the top what a patient resource is. It then shows you the structure that is a patient resource. It's cardinality for all the elements. It's got some terminology bindings, which I wouldn't get too worried about yet. But right at the bottom is the key thing you want. Here, the search parameters. So I searched on family name and I searched on given name. But I could have used any one of these search parameters. And as I said before, there's consistency here that this is the patient resource. But if I go back to the resources and look at any other one of these like organization, it's the same structure. Got a description of what it does, the structure of what it looks like, and at the bottom, the search parameters I can use on it. We might have to wrap it up there. It's 10:02. Thank you everyone for attending. I hope it was useful, and have fun at the Connectathon, and remember to bring a laptop.